The date was January 7, 1945. To the casual observer, the end of the Second World War in Europe seemed inevitable. The Allies had landed in Normandy 7 months prior, Paris had been liberated, and the Russian bear was clawing its way toward Berlin from the east. But inside the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, the mood was not one of impending triumph, but of toxic volatility. In a warm, well-lit room in the Netherlands, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Britain's most celebrated, capable, and notoriously arrogant military commander, stood before a battery of microphones and newsreel cameras. He wore his trademark beret and that slight, self-satisfied smile that had irritated American generals from Tunisia to Sicily. He was there to brief the world on the Battle of the Bulge, the massive German counteroffensive that had just been halted in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. Montgomery believed he was about to solidify his legacy as the savior of the Western Front. He believed he was simply stating the facts of the battle. But what he did not know, as the shutters clicked and the pens of journalists scratched across notepads, was that he was lighting the fuse on a diplomatic bomb that threatened to destroy the Anglo-American alliance mere months before the fall of Germany. This is the story of a military genius who couldn't read a room, a prime minister who had to choose between national pride and survival, and the untold crisis that nearly turned the Allies against one another, while Hitler watched with glee. The winter of despair. To understand the magnitude of Montgomery's mistake, one must first understand the hellscape that preceded it. 3 weeks earlier, on December 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler had rolled the dice for the last time. Stripping the Eastern Front of vital armor, he launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, a ghost front where exhausted American divisions had been sent to rest. The German goal was ambitious to the point of insanity: split the Allied armies, seize the vital supply port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The attack, known today as the Battle of the Bulge, was a nightmare of snow, fog, and shrapnel. The American lines buckled. Panic spread. Communication wires were severed by German saboteurs dressed in American uniforms. In the chaos, the structure of the Allied command broke down. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, was located in Luxembourg, south of the German thrust. However, 2 of his armies, the U.S. 1st and 9th, were located to the north of the Bulge, effectively cut off from their commander by the German wedge. It was here that General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, made a decision that was militarily sound, but politically radioactive. Realizing Bradley could not control the northern armies from the south, Eisenhower temporarily transferred command of those hundreds of thousands of American troops to Field Marshal Montgomery, who commanded the British 21st Army Group in the north. It was a decision born of emergency. Eisenhower needed a commander on the ground who could communicate with the troops. Montgomery, for all his faults, was a brilliant defensive tactician. He reorganized the lines, tidied up the battlefield, and brought British reserves to backstop the American positions. However, the fighting, the dying, the bleeding, the freezing was done almost exclusively by Americans. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held out against total encirclement without winter clothing or sufficient ammunition. In the foxholes of Elsenburn Ridge and St. Vith, young G's faced King Tiger tanks with bazookas and sheer grit. They died by the tens of thousands to stop the German advance. By January 7th, the crisis had passed. Patton's Third Army had broken through to Bastogne from the south. The weather had cleared, allowing Allied air power to decimate German columns, and the Nazis were in retreat. The battle was won. The question now was, who would claim the credit? The press conference, the room at Montgomery's tactical headquarters, was packed. Journalists from the United States, Britain, and across the Commonwealth had gathered, sensing a story. They expected a briefing on the next phase of the war. What they got was a lecture. Montgomery began to speak, his voice clipping with that patrician, British cadence that sounded authoritative to Londoners, but condescending to Americans. He did not speak of the blood in the snow or the heroism of the GIs who had frozen to death holding the line. Instead, he spoke of strategy. He spoke of himself. "The battle has been most interesting," Montgomery mused, leaning into the microphones. "I think possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled." The word hung in the air, handled to the American correspondents. Men who had just returned from the front lines, where they saw frozen limbs and burning tanks. The battle was a tragedy and a meat grinder. To hear it described as interesting, as if it were a Sunday cricket match or a complex chess puzzle, was jarring. Montgomery continued, oblivious to the temperature in the room. He described the early days of the German attack. "The first thing to be done was to head off the German attack. I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies." You thus have the picture of British troops fighting on both sides of American forces who have suffered a hard blow. He waved his hands, painting a picture that was technically accurate, but emotionally dishonest. He described the battlefield as if the Americans were confused children who had been scattered by the bully, only to be rescued by the steady, professional British Big Brother. He praised the American soldiers for fighting very bravely, but the praise felt like a pat on the head. The subtext was screamingly loud. The Americans failed. "I saved them. Then came the fatal blow." A journalist asked about his relationship with Eisenhower. Montgomery replied, "Eisenhower placed me in command of the whole Northern Front. I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies. This was a proper thing to do. A proper thing to do." The implication was clear. It was the only logical thing to do. And perhaps, he implied, he should have been in command of the ground forces all along. For months, Montgomery had been lobbying to replace Eisenhower as the land forces commander, relegating Ike to a purely administrative role. This press conference was his public audition for the job. As he stepped away from the podium, possibly expecting applause, Montgomery had no idea he had just committed political suicide. The American volcano, the reaction at American headquarters was not just anger. It was hatred. The transcript of the press conference hit the desk of General Omar Bradley like a physical slap. Bradley, known as the GI's general, was a man of quiet temperament, rarely given to outbursts. But he had just spent weeks agonizing over his inability to reach his trapped men in the North. Watching his casualty reports swell to horrific numbers, over 19,000 Americans killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 missing. To have a British general whose contribution to the battle had been largely reserve support and tactical tiding claim credit for the victory was unforgivable. Bradley went to Eisenhower and issued an ultimatum: "I cannot serve under Montgomery again. If he is to be put in command of American troops in the future, you must send me home." General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, was less diplomatic. Upon hearing the report, he opened his diary and furiously scribbled that Montgomery was a tired little fart who was fighting for British headlines rather than Allied victory. Patton, a student of history who fancied himself a warrior poet, expressed a genuine desire to challenge the Field Marshal to a duel, but the rage wasn't confined to the generals. The American press corps, having transcribed Montgomery's cricket match analogy, sent their dispatches home. The next morning, newspapers across the United States exploded. British general claims he saved Yanks. Montgomery belittles U.S. command. Radio commentators in New York and Washington began to ask dangerous questions. Why were American boys dying to support British arrogance? Why was the United States, which was now providing the vast majority of men, tanks, and fuel, being treated like a junior partner? In Washington, Congress began to rumble. There were whispers of reviewing the Lend-Lease agreements, or even demanding that American troops be withdrawn from any joint command structure. The special relationship, the bedrock upon which the entire Western Front rested, was cracking. The view from London across the English Channel. Winston Churchill sat in the cabinet room at number 10 Downing Street. The Prime Minister looked older than his years. The war had ravaged him, just as it had ravaged London. He was a man who lived by the power of words, and when he read the transcript of Montgomery's conference, his face went crimson. "That damn fool," Churchill reportedly shouted, throwing the papers down. "That insufferable, preening, damn fool." Churchill's anger was different from Eisenhower's or Bradley's. It wasn't about military pride. It was about geopolitical survival. Churchill possessed a terrifying clarity about Britain's position in the world that Montgomery lacked. Montgomery still lived in a world where the British Empire was the dominant global superpower, where the Union Jack flew over a quarter of the globe, and Americans were wealthy, uncultured upstarts. Churchill knew the truth. Britain was bankrupt. The country was exhausted, running on fumes and American credit. The Royal Navy was now eclipsed by the U.S. Navy. The British Army was scraping the bottom of the manpower barrel. They were drafting teenagers and old men to fill the ranks, while America was shipping fresh divisions across the Atlantic. Every month. Churchill knew that the moment Germany surrendered, a new conflict would begin, a cold standoff with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. Britain needed America not just to finish the war, but to survive the peace. If the American public turned against Britain now, if they decided the British were ungrateful liabilities, the United States might retreat back into isolationism after the war, leaving a weakened Britain alone to face the Red Army. Montgomery was treating the war like a competition for glory. Churchill knew it was a fight for existence. The Prime Minister summoned his chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Brooke. Brooke was Montgomery's mentor and staunchest defender, often protecting Monty from Churchill's wrath. But not today. "Monty seems to think this is about British glory," Churchill growled at Brooke. "But we are not fighting this war for glory. We are fighting for survival. And right now, our survival depends on American goodwill." Brooke tried to interject, arguing that technically, Montgomery had coordinated the defense effectively. He tried to explain the nuance of the command shift. Churchill cut him off with a ferocity that shook the room. "I don't give a damn about technically. The Americans bled in the Ardennes. They died in numbers that would shock the British public if they knew. And Montgomery stands there like a peacock taking bows. It is not just wrong, it is dangerous." Churchill knew he had to act, but he was in a bind. Montgomery was a hero to the British public. He was the victor of Man, the man who beat Rommel. Firing him would topple Churchill's government, but leaving the insult unanswered might break the alliance. The private Rebuke. Churchill first attempted to handle the situation quietly. He drafted a letter to Montgomery. It was a masterpiece of controlled fury. In the draft, Churchill wrote, "Your remarks have caused grave damage to Allied unity at a critical juncture. The Americans are not our subordinates to be patronized and corrected. They are our partners, our saviors in many respects, and increasingly the dominant force in this alliance." He went further, threatening the unthinkable. "If you cannot conduct yourself with the humility and tact that our position demands, then your services, however distinguished, may become a liability we cannot afford." Ultimately, Churchill, ever the politician, decided not to send the harshest version of the letter. Instead, he worked through the back channels. He pressured Montgomery to send a letter of apology and clarification to Eisenhower. Montgomery, finally realizing the precipice he was standing on, complied. He wrote a stiff, formal letter to Ike, praising the American troops and affirming his loyalty. Eisenhower accepted the letter with grace, but the damage was done. The trust was gone. The American generals would never look at Montgomery the same way again. But the public damage, the headlines in New York, the anger in the U.S. Congress remained. A private letter between generals would not fix the public perception that Britain was laughing at American dead. Churchill realized he had to do something unprecedented. He had to humiliate his own best general in public, without making it look like a humiliation. The speech to the Commons on January 18, 1945. 11 days after Montgomery's press conference, the House of Commons was packed. The air was thick with smoke and anticipation. The members of Parliament knew there was tension with Washington, but few knew the depths of the crisis. Churchill rose to the dispatch box. He adjusted his glasses and looked out at the assembly. He began a speech that would go down in history as a masterclass in diplomacy. He started by describing the battle, using his soaring rhetoric to paint the German offensive as a terrifying beast. He praised the strategic decisions. And then, he began the dismantling of Bernard Montgomery. He did not name the Field Marshal. He did not criticize him directly. Instead, he used cold, hard data to obliterate Montgomery's narrative. "I have seen it suggested," Churchill rumbled, "that the terrific battle which has been proceeding since December 16th on the American front is an Anglo-American battle. In fact, however, the United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses." The silence in the chamber was absolute. Churchill continued, "Only one British Army corps has been engaged in this action. All the rest of the 30 or so divisions which have been fighting continuously for the last month are United States troops." He then dropped the statistic that served as the final nail in the coffin of Montgomery's ego. "The Americans have engaged 30 or 40 men for every one we have engaged, and they have lost 60 to 80 men for every one of ours." 60 to 80 men, with that single statistic. Churchill shamed anyone in the room and anyone in Britain who felt entitled to claim credit for the victory. He shifted the focus from the generals to the grieving families. Care must be taken not to claim for the British armies an undue share of what is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. He warned, "We must not forget that it is to American homes that the telegrams of personal loss and anxiety have been going during the past month." It was a profound moment of humility. The leader of the British Empire was standing before his government and publicly bowing to the American sacrifice. He was telling the world this was their victory, paid for with their blood. The aftermath and legacy. The effect of the speech was immediate. The transcript was wired to Washington and New York instantly. The New York Times ran headlines the next day praising Churchill's magnanimity and fairness. The talk in Congress of pulling troops subsided. Eisenhower sent a personal telegram thanking Churchill for the intervention. The crisis was averted, but for Montgomery, the consequences were permanent. While he remained in command of the 21st Army Group and would eventually accept the German surrender on Lüneburg Heath, his influence was severely curtailed. When the Allies crossed the Rhine for the final push into Germany, Eisenhower ensured that the main thrust was given to Bradley, not Montgomery. The supreme commander role that Montgomery so desperately coveted was forever out of reach. He had proven himself tactically brilliant but politically incompetent. Behind closed doors, Churchill's assessment of Montgomery became even harsher. He confided to his secretary that Monty was a problem we must manage. He famously remarked, "Montgomery won at El Alamein, and he's been dining on it ever since. But he doesn't understand that we've moved beyond the days when Britain could win this war alone." There is a chilling postscript to this story that validates Churchill's fears. After the war, historians combing through captured German archives found intelligence reports from January 1945. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, had been monitoring the Allied press closely. When the Montgomery scandal broke, the Nazi propaganda machine went into overdrive. They broadcast messages to American troops on the front lines, telling them that the British were laughing at them, that they were dying for an empire that despised them, for a brief, flickering moment. German intelligence analysts believed the alliance might actually crack. They reported to Hitler that the political divide was the miracle they had been waiting for. It didn't happen, largely because Churchill refused to let it. The hard truth of coalition warfare. We often look back on World War II through the lens of nostalgia. We see the band of brothers, the unified front against evil, the inevitable victory. But the story of January 7, 1945, reveals a messier, more human truth. The Allies did not win because they were naturally best friends. They didn't win because of a lack of ego or national rivalry. They won despite those things. They won because, at the critical moments, there were leaders capable of swallowing their pride for the greater good. Field Marshal Montgomery was a man of war, a man of maps, logistics, and tactics. He saw the Battle of the Bulge as a problem to be solved and handled. But Winston Churchill was a man of history. He understood that a battle won on the field could be lost in the newspapers. He understood that the hearts of the American people were as strategic a resource as oil or steel.